Welcome, everybody. Delighted to see so many people here and looking forward to our discussions today. You may have detected from my accent that I don't have a full claim of Irishness, but I have the Irish heritage, so I'm part of that diaspora which was both affected by these events and benefited in a certain kind of way. I thought I'd say one or two things just quickly before we begin. Say something about the kind of contested legacy of 1916. I teach at the National University of Ireland Galway. Ireland has been overtaken by events of commemoration associated with the Easter Rising, but it's worth emphasizing that this is not a straightforward process in Ireland for a number of reasons. One, because of political violence is never a straightforward issue. There is the kind of counterfactual question, would Britain have kept faith, to kind of quote Yeats? Would Home Rule have been a legitimate alternative? Would it have succeeded? How would the problem of Northern Ireland have been resolved? Then you have, moving forward, the 50th anniversary, 1966, of the commemoration, which was clearly contested in very particular kinds of ways. Just, as the troubles began to emerge some years later, it was almost overshadowed by those events. But not straightforward, precisely because there was always a danger of Sinn Féin taking over these commemorations, and that has remained in place. Even the business of military parades on Easter, very problematic in Ireland, and only in recent years has the military resurfaced on the streets in Ireland. This year there have been major public events. There was a reading of the proclamation that Eileen just quoted from, this important document that we'll hear more about today, which was the announcement of these events. So it's still a difficult inheritance. When legitimate governments commemorate events which involve rebellion, I think they always feel slightly nervous about these matters, even as they want to honor that heritage and mark the occasion and the sacrifice that took place. So looking forward to today's discussion, which will be wide-ranging. We have two speakers in our first session from the National University of Ireland Galway, so I'll introduce both of them and then they'll give their papers. We'll have discussion afterwards. Our first speaker is Dr. Conor McNamara. Conor is the 1916 scholar in residence at NUI Galway. He's based in the Moore Institute, which is the institute that I direct. And he's been doing research on 1916 in the wider context. And this is an important university initiative to actually support something of this kind, to look at the archives, to make connections with the public. And as I say, there have been huge numbers of events in Ireland, so it really would be unparalleled in terms of public interest and involvement and participation. His work has been on political violence and social upheaval in 19th century and 20th century Ireland. He's written on food shortage in the West and social upheaval during the Revolutionary period, and is the author of Easter Rebellion 1916, A New Illustrated History. Our second speaker is John Cunningham, who is in the Department of History. He's a lecturer there. John has recently been the editor of SEHAR, which is the Journal of Irish Labour History, the Irish Labour History Society, I should say. And he is the co-editor of Lives on the Left, Studies in Irish Radical Leadership, which is just coming out from Manchester University Press in 2016. So we'll begin with Conor, and Conor is going to be speaking about the 1916 rebellion and the dream of America. Conor, come on in.
Thanks very much, Dan and Eileen. And thanks everyone for coming, for organising and so on. So take your time there. So what I'd just like to talk about today really is the centrality of the United States and the Irish-American community, and particularly in the northeastern United States, to the rebellion. It's a self-consciously international event. It's designed to be international, and it is in its conspiratorial genesis international. So the 1916 rebellion in Dublin was a self-consciously international event planned by a small coterie of men, most of whom had spent considerable time in the United States, and by an organisation, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, founded in 1858 at the prompting of Irish Americans, and largely funded throughout its existence from the same source. If we look here at the leadership of the rebellion and the Republican movement at this time, James Connolly here lived in New York and New Jersey from 1898 to 1900, and again for 7 years, 1903 to 1910. Thomas Clark lived in Brooklyn and later had a farm in Manorville, which I believe is in Long Island, stand to be corrected there, 1898 to 1907, and was an American citizen. Some people balk at that and aren't clear that it is, but his wife, Kathleen Clark, in her biography, Revolutionary Woman, says he had attained American citizenship. Then some slightly lesser known but seminal figures in the period. Bulmer Hobson spent considerable time, 2 years in 1907, again in 1914 in the northeastern states. Patrick Mcgarrity, a crucial man in the early planning of the early years of the Revolution, lived in Philadelphia for 7 years. Roger Casement spent considerable time in New York and New Jersey. And again, Pierce himself. So these are people intimately familiar with the United States. So on a practical level, the support for the American Fenian organisation, Clann na Gael, founded in 1867, was crucial to the Easter Rebellion in Dublin. Clann na Gael had two primary roles: to fund the development and arming of the Irish volunteers, and secondly, to develop clandestine communications with the German Imperial Command with the aim of soliciting military support for the rebellion. On the financial front, Clann na Gael succeeded admirably, and on the German front they failed dismally. So for the Fenians of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, however, America had an ideological as well as practical role in terms of elevating the Irish nation from perceived cultural, political and economic degradation. The emerging economic and political success of the Irish, particularly in the northeastern United States, proved for many Republicans in Ireland that other Ireland, Irish Americans in the American Republic, free from the prejudice, misgovernment and sectarianism of British misrule, could realise their true potential as citizens of a democratic republic untainted by ethnic subservience. So you can see there, the Fenian and Clann na Gael movement has very much a social character to it in New York there. You can see their excursion to Coney Island. IRB Veterans Association there again on East 59th Street. A lecture there by Pierce himself when he came in 1914. Of course, his school was largely funded by New York Irish Americans, particularly John Devoy and so on. So from its inception in 1867, Clann na Gael coordinated militant Irish republicanism in the United States and provided financial backing for their Irish comrades in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. By the opening decades of the 20th century, John Devoy and Joseph Mcgarrity were the two most powerful leaders on the American Fenian movement. From their bases in New York and Philadelphia, respectively, they orchestrated a sophisticated publicity and fundraising effort on behalf of the Irish volunteers in Ireland. The centrality of financial support from the Irish American community was continuously emphasised in the Gaelic American, which was the newspaper of Clann na Gael. And in June 1914, the paper declared, "Money talks, as we Yankees say, and it ought to be set talking in every city of the United States at the earliest possible moment." So North American funds were fundamental to the Republican struggle. And from 1907 onwards, John Devoy claimed that regular sums of no less than $1,000 at a time reached the Supreme Council of the IRB at home in Ireland. He later claimed that the Clann contributed in total $100,000 to the Irish volunteers and the IRB in the 7 years leading up to the 1916 rebellion. In February 1916, the Revolutionary Directory of Clann na Gael was notified by the Supreme Council of the IRB in Dublin that an insurrection was imminent. Devoy later recalled in his memoir, "The communication said they wanted German military help after they had struck the first blow, and did not in any way request it before they themselves had risen. This is a very important point," he claimed, "which sets at rest all charges that had been made of bad faith on behalf of Germany. Their plan was distinctly stated, to start the fight alone if necessary, and to obtain in hope German assistance if possible." So by 1903 on, Devoy edited the weekly Gaelic American, published in New York, with a circulation in the tens of thousands. It served as the main conduit for information about the activities of Republicans in the United States and the Irish volunteers at home. Devoy gathered a cadre of revolutionaries around the newspaper, including Thomas Clark, who acted as assistant editor and was later executed for his leadership of the rebellion. Devoy, born in 1842, died in 1928, was instrumental in organising the American support. He joined Clann in 1871 and served as the secretary of its Revolutionary Directory. From his headquarters, he worked for a public alliance continually between the American revolutionaries of Clann na Gael and the earlier Charles Stuart's Parnell parliamentary nationalists, a move referred to famously as the New Departure. Devoy's life reflects the tireless contribution of Irish America to the separatist struggle in Ireland, and notably through fundraising, a continuity in that aspect of Irish American fundraising that continued right up until the 90s. So there's a classic example of Gaelic American fundraising with bonds. You can see John Devoy has signed that, $25,000. He joined, rather bizarrely, in his 40s, Na Fianna Éireann, which was a Boy Scout movement, but obviously it was to contribute $1,000. And there he is. Oh, sorry, that's our later man I'm coming to now, Joseph Mcgarrity. So our man, Big Joe, born in 1874, was Devoy's co-conspirator. He was the principal driving force behind the fundraising efforts along with Devoy. Born in Carrickmore, County Tyrone, Mcgarrity immigrated to the United States in 1892, settled in Philadelphia and joining Clan na Gael in 1893. Over the following 2 decades, he built a substantial fortune in the hotel and wholesale liquor business. He was elected district officer for the Philadelphia region of the clan, and in 1912 was a member of its national executive. So we can see a little bit here. Well, this is an interesting item. Shortly before the rebellion, we're going to come to published in the American newspapers. US volunteers are ready to sail for Ireland. According to the Evening Sun, 550 Dublin-born Irishmen in and about New York City have formed a regiment of volunteers for the assistance of their brothers in Ireland in view of any possible trouble in Ulster. You get a lot of this high-blown rhetoric that often doesn't come to pass. But this idea of sending a regiment is now largely forgotten, but was very much discussed at the time, sending home Irishmen to fight. As the Gaelic American editorials made clear, the clan considered themselves the defenders of Irish literature and language in the United States, and remained ever vigilant in combating what they saw as rampant Anglophone tendencies in American politics and journalism on the eve of the Great War. In the weekly list of contributors to the Irish National Volunteers, Mcgarrity and his organisers regularly appear at the top due to hefty donations, personally contributed. Devoy noted the fundraising prowess of Philadelphia. I probably shouldn't single out Philly since I'm in New York, but they wrote in 1914, "Philly is far in the lead, but other cities are making vigorous efforts to overtake it. New York has made an okay start. Boston has done something. Indianapolis is working hard. Chicago has undertaken to do its share, and Buffalo has yet to make a start." There's an obvious incentive by publishing the names of contributors to gain status within your Irish American community also, that you could be seen to give, not just to give. And the kind of stock in trade images that, again, there's an overlap between AOH, perceived constitutional nationalism often bore all the hallmarks of militant nationalism, and there isn't a fine distinction between the two. Éireann go bra. You can see here, interestingly, is that Mcgarrity's membership of a lot of German solidarity organisations in the United States. And this, as we'll see, casts the clan into something of a crisis when the war breaks out. So Mcgarrity himself met regularly with Patrick Pearse, Roger Casement and Bulmer Hobson during their US trips in 1914 and helped coordinate their speaking engagements and meetings. From his homes and businesses in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, Mcgarrity consulted with the Irish leadership about the ever-urgent need for arms and funds in the month leading up to the Rising. Shortly before the rebellion, he established in March 1916 the Friends of Irish Freedom, an organisation, a front dominated by himself and his Fenian conspirators. After the Rising, the body raised $350,000 for the relief of those deported and or the families of those executed. So the dynamics of Irish American nationalism should be considered within the context of migration and diaspora. By 1900, close on 5 million Americans were Irish-born or had at least one Irish-born parent. I'm grateful to my wife for this research, which I've stolen from her PhD thesis, soon to be completed at Notre Dame University. Under the direction of Clan na Gael and later Friends of Irish Freedom, Irish American activists preached the compatibility of Irish republicanism with American democratic ideals of national self-determination. Thus, rather than being backward-looking, Irish American nationalism was portrayed as driven by a dynamic, upwardly mobile cadre of politicians and journalists and businessmen alike, concentrated in America's thriving entrepreneurial cities. The outbreak of the war, however, resurrected fundamental questions within American society surrounding nationality, nationalism, ethnicity, and inclusion, following decades of unprecedented emigration. So President Woodrow Wilson's attitude towards the Irish question before and after the Rising demonstrated the parameters of his government's thinking on issues concerning imperialism. Wilson himself waged a war for the American mind, focused on what he regarded as the ambiguous loyalty of hyphenated Americans, first and second generations of American or European descent. With the outbreak of the war, the Wilson administration passed strict censorship laws that targeted ethnic and foreign language publications, seeking to solidify the allegiance of an increasingly foreign-born population. In this context, the pro-German sentiments of Devoy and Mcgarrity and Clonegale horrified the American political establishment. So you can see they're cast into, that's a later picture, into reconstructing themselves as essentially republicanism is the American dream at home, that we have to forget about the hyphen Irish American, because what the Irish are doing is essentially behaving like Americans almost, seeking a republic, seeking self-determination, and to cast off ethnic and essentially the old world of monarchy and so on of Europe. They're the papers for the German trip of Joseph Mary Plunkett in 1915, of course, organised to gain German support and funded from New York City. So what I'd like to do now is just talk briefly. We won't go into the sad affair of the failure of German arms to land that many people might be familiar with. Someone might like to sing a ballad about it a bit later, and we'll all shed a small tear in memory of how the 30,000 rifles failed to land on from Germany off the Cork and Kerry coast, thus dooming, maybe not dooming, but certainly limiting the capacity for rebellion in Ireland. So fundraising spectacularly successful. The endeavours of the German link, unfortunately, collapsed. When we read the papers, actually, the Germans simply don't take Joseph Mary Plunkett very seriously, or Roger Casement, or his American backers. And it's really quite a disastrous attempt. But the title of the paper, The Dream of America, essentially represents the dream of America by both Irish Republicans and the dream of America in terms of Irish Americans in America and how they perceived any future republic. In a series of letters to the Irish senior leader, Mcgarrity, written in 1914, Patrick Pearse, one of the key conspirators, made clear the centrality of American support for the rising in Ireland. He wrote, "A supreme moment for Ireland may be at hand. We shall go down to our graves beaten and disgraced men if we are not ready for it. The men are sound, especially in Dublin. We could at any moment rally the best of them to our support by a coup d'etat and rally the whole country. If the coup d'etat were successful, no matter how badly things look, no matter what account you hear of loyalty or recruiting to the military, rely upon the men here to do all that is possible." Pearse's acknowledgement of the centrality of practical assistance from the States in his struggle was mired in the centrality of the transformative potential of the idea of America itself to a rising generation of Irish Republicans. Pearse was not interested in creating a new Irish state, but new Irish people. And in this respect, while both Bulmer Hobson and Pearse believed passionately in the doctrine of an Ireland not merely free, but Gaelican free, like the majority of Republicans, they looked to the Irish in America for inspiration for what they could achieve at home once they had been taught to jettison their perceived inferiority to all things British, embrace their manifest destiny, not just as an independent state, but as a distinct race. For Pearse and others, the popular acceptance of the inferiority of Irishness as both a culture and a nationality had been jettisoned on the other side of the Atlantic by Irish Americans, who, by crossing the sea, had liberated themselves from the stasis, as they saw it, of a tepid national political culture, which had become merely a pallid imitation of the worst aspects of British culture. Irish Americans, he claimed, had not one, but two identities of which to be proud, and he claimed in New York, "Unlike at home, the Irish nation," he said, "is ashamed of its past." Thus, to Pearse and others, the Republican struggle was inseparable from culture and political components alike. He said it is more than an historically great struggle that is going on in Ireland. It is a battle of two nations. We must undo the English conquest and re-establish in Ireland her supremacy. Thus, the progress of the Irish in America, manifest in their material, social and political progress, was an inspiration in terms of what the infusion of republic ideals could precipitate at home once the yoke of cultural inferiority was eroded. In this respect, the fusion of an imagined Gaelic idyll with modern ideas regarding social and economic progress was neither unusual nor contradictory in the formative discourse of 20th century European nationalism, as the ancestral voices of the past formed the vital archaeology in the construction of the modern and the future. In this respect, Pearse was a modern thinker, and the degree to which Gaelic history and culture was romanticised or imagined is largely irrelevant. It mattered merely that people forged a belief in an historical communal experience which would inform civic pride of the present. So in conclusion then, in the discourse of Irish republicanism in the early 20th century, the need for national resurgence implied cultural degradation. The desire for spiritual renewal implied moral decline. And for Pearse and others, Easter 1916 ultimately represented the resurrection of a nation who, as they consciously pointed out, like the American people, could throw off their ancient shackles and no longer be ashamed of their past or who they were. In due course, the promise which America held for revolutionaries in Ireland remained ultimately unfulfilled. And likewise, the conservative nature of the Irish Free State proved to be a major disappointment for any Irish Americans. For a brief period, however, the idea of an historical moment which would provide the opportunity for new national cultural beginnings, of a manifest destiny unfettered by empire, and the prospect of a rebirth of an entire people long divided and oppressed, represented not just the American dream, but an Irish vision also. Pearse told an audience in Philadelphia in 1914, "In recent years we have seen again the ancient truths, heard the ancient voices, and we are swinging back to the old lives and walking the old paths, taking up the work that has not been accomplished by those who came before us. We have set our faces towards old paths, taken up the old work, and we hope the opportunities that the mercy of God and the support of our Irish American brothers will take us there." Ramila Mahagov.
Well, it's good to be here, and nice to see a good crowd in the room. We're ready to roll here. We got James Connolly there at the centre of things, and he'll dominate. He'll dominate rather than Larkin, but Larkin is a secondary figure in what I'm going to say today. A lot of some of it was edited out essentially for time reasons. Now, referring to these two people, James Connolly and James Larkin, in her memoir, Rebel Girl, the New York radical Elizabeth Gurley Flynn declared herself, and I quote, "proud to have had the opportunity to count both of these truly great sons of Erin as my comrades and friends." Remarkably, these two great icons of Irish labour spent as much time in the United States in the period between 1900 and the end of the Civil War in 1923 as they did in Ireland. And Connolly, of course, is dead long before that, having been executed for his part in the 1916 Rising, while Larkin, who was initially assumed by many in Ireland to have been the instigator of the Rising, was actually in New York he was in the United States when it took place in Chicago. But before discussing their New York experiences, their connections, influences, and so on, I have to introduce these two class warriors, starting with Connolly. Connolly was born in Edinburgh. Here we are. There he is in a slum there in 1868, the youngest of three sons of Irish Catholic immigrants. He went out to work before he was 10, joined the British Army by the time he was 14, 15, having falsified his age. They didn't seem to have checked too hard, checked the credentials too hard. He served in Ireland, deserted by the time he was 21, and married Lily Reynolds, who we met in Dublin. He followed his brother John into the socialist movement, and he quickly became one of the most prominent socialists in Scotland. He wasn't merely an activist, though he was also a writer and a theorist informed by Marxism, which was remarkable given his limited education. In 1896, he was hired as an organiser by a small socialist society in Dublin, and within months he changed the name of that society to the Irish Socialist Republican Party. And 2 years later, he founded a party newspaper, the Workers' Republic. The name of both the party and the paper are essentially marking the birth of an ideology, essentially, of socialist republicanism. Connolly was deliberately targeting Republicans with the argument that simple separatism, simple Irish independence wasn't enough. And this is the oft-cited quote from Connolly, which makes that point as early as 1897. Well, I'll let you read it yourselves. Now, previous Irish socialist groups were offshoots of British bodies. What Connolly is about here is establishing a distinctively Irish strain of socialism, if you like. But his Irish Socialist Republican Party was small. You can see it here. A bit out of focus. That was the joke. More syllables than members. But anyway. Now, Connolly's initial contact with American socialism was with an alumnus and sometimes professor of Columbia University. That was a man called Daniel De Leon. De Leon was one of the best-known socialists in America, leader of the far-left Socialist Labour Party. And lest anyone think in identifying with Labour, he was a typical alumnus. I don't think so. Generally, Columbia students, certainly, at that stage are more associated with organised strike breaking in the transit sector and so on. But an atypical product. Now, in 1897, De Leon had written to Connolly's party seeking help in reaching Irish Americans. He also published Connolly's pamphlet, or republished Connolly's pamphlet, Erin's Hope, in 1900. And this is Connolly's, before he invites Connolly to come over. Connolly was on the left of the socialist movement. He had his own position in relation to Irish freedom. But what he shared with De Leon was opposition to the co-option of socialists in the political sphere, which is beginning to happen in some places at that stage, and also opposition to a tendency in trade unions to exclusivity, rigid demarcations, and so on, which inhibited, in the view of both De Leon and Connolly, practical solidarity. And these attitudes were a feature of the emerging approach in trade unionism known as syndicalism. We'll come back to that. So in 1902 then came the fateful invitation from De Leon to Connolly to do a speaking tour of the United States. Did I show you De Leon at all? Here we are. Columbia, as it was before it reached, it was on this site in the late 19th century. De Leon wanted to attract Americans of Irish background to his Socialist Labour Party, and he also wanted to consolidate a potentially useful ally on the other side of the Atlantic. For Connolly, the invitation was an opportunity to fundraise for his own party and to sell subscriptions for his Workers' Republic. So he was billed as, and I quote, the foremost representative of socialism in the Emerald Isle. So with that advertising, he embarked on a 3-month tour. He appeared on a platform alongside De Leon in the Coopers Union Hall in New York. He was exposed during his tour, during an extensive tour, to the quarrels on the American socialist movement, and he was quite successful on the fundraising side of things. Back on the other side of the Atlantic, after his 3 months were up, he was prominent in establishing a Delayonite party in Scotland. So his connection with Scotland would have continued. In Ireland, there's frictions with his party comrades. You won't believe what they did with the money he sent back to Ireland. They decided they'd invest it in a bar. So Connolly, to use an Irish expression, was fit to be tied because it lost, especially given that it lost money. He was quite abstemious himself. So he was so cross he resigned from the party. He was he irritated people in the manner of his resignation so much that they accepted it. So soon after, a young James Joyce joined the party. But the future author of Ulysses was no replacement in the political sphere for Connolly, and the party's fortunes faded. So he had no means then, and few enough prospects, so he decides to return to America, thinking especially of the opportunities of his 6 daughters, and you saw 2 of them in the earlier slide there. Now, things started very badly on that front. And when Connolly met his wife Lily and their children off the boat, one of the daughters was missing. She had died in a fire just before the family left Dublin. So quite a shock, a shocking thing. Work-wise too, there was severe disappointment. Connolly had been expecting a paid position in De Leon's party, but he ended up working in shop floor positions, later selling in insurance. Now, this is a period of intensely fought labour struggles in the United States. You have large-scale battles between armed strikebreakers and striking workers in mines and across the cities in transport disputes. So Connolly's engaged with this. He's also engaged with the politics of the Socialist Labour Party. However, he soon falls foul of his mentor, De Leon. There was a difference over an arcane matter of Marxist economic theory, and also over the presentation of party policy in relation to religion and marriage. Connolly's attitude derived from what he knew about the sensitivities of Irish Catholics in particular, and whereas socialists would have different attitude, marriage being an oppressive instrument, making woman the property of men and so on. But the general approach at this time of socialists to marriage and religion indeed was to treat them as belonging to the private sphere. But there was still some gentle mockery entering party publications, as you might expect. There's discussions in the party press of August Bebel's Socialism and Woman, which Connolly takes issue with. Now, De Leon was a fairly arrogant man, and he didn't like being challenged, especially by somebody who left school at 10, I suspect. But he was given to ad hominem attacks, essentially. And his response to Connolly's challenging him on these positions was to accuse Connolly of being a Jesuit spy. Later, he would accuse him, he would up the ante a little bit by calling him a police spy. But the relationship, in any case, remained fraught. And Connolly ultimately abandoned the Socialist Labour Party for the broader-based Socialist Party of America. Now, before that, there came a change in the theatre of operations, if you like, with the establishment in 1905 of a new movement. You saw Connolly on its platform at the first slide, the industrial workers of the world. This was a syndicalist movement in that it considered that trade unions, rather than political parties, were the best vehicle for socialist transformation. De Leon was a founder member, but he irritated others in the party by using his own little party to try to direct the affairs of the trade union. Connolly agreed on most of with De Leon and some of the criticisms he made and some of his objectives, but disliked the way he went about it. So ultimately, he goes over to the Chicago IWW, which later became known as the Wobblies. Now, another difference with De Leon was in relation to the proper approach to ethnic groups. Connolly was impressed by the Italian Socialist Federation, and he became involved himself in establishing an Irish Socialist Federation in 1907. De Leon accused him